Hi everyone. There are lots of people who try to prove the historicity of the Trojan War by examining contemporary Hittite records. After all, we have a lot of Hittite records from the Bronze Age which describe conflict and various events occurring in Western Anatolia, even including in the region of the Troad. So it makes sense that if the Trojan War really happened in that era, we might be able to find traces of it in these Hittite records. And according to some people, we can. According to some people, we can even identify specific individuals from the legends in these Hittite records. But is this really true? Well, let's take a look at the evidence. Okay, so one of the main pieces of evidence is the fact that in these Hittite records, we find lots of references to a nation called the Ahhiyawa invading and conquering and plundering various parts of Western Anatolia. And according to many scholars, in fact, this is the consensus, this name, the Ahhiyawa, is a Hittite rendering of the Greek ethnonym, which is often rendered in English as the Achaeans. You can see the Greek and Hittite forms there. So many scholars, in fact, the majority of scholars who look into this subject, conclude that these two names are related. In other words, the Hittite records that refer to this nation plundering Western Anatolia, they're talking about the Mycenaean Greeks. So that would appear to confirm that the Greeks were engaged in military campaigns in Western Anatolia in the Bronze Age. So that seems to tie in with the basic setting of the story of the Trojan War, the idea that loads of Greeks invaded and attacked Western Anatolia, because it wasn't just Troy that was being attacked in the story of the Trojan War. It takes place over 10 years, and that's not just devoted to attacking the city of Troy. Over the course of those 10 years, the Greeks attack a huge area around Western Anatolia because they're attacking the allies of Troy as well. So they attack numerous other cities and territories. So this fits in with the basic setting of the Iliad, the scenario that we see in these Hittite records. We see this scenario where Bronze Age Greeks were attacking a large area in Western Anatolia. So on the face of it, that seems like it fits in very well. But we can go even further than that, and this is a really crucial part. There's one letter between the Hittites and the king of apparently the Greeks, which refers to a conflict involving a settlement called Woosa. Now, because of several references to this city, scholars today generally agree that Woosa is Troy, the settlement of Troy at Hisarlik in northwest Anatolia. The actual name Woosa is considered to be a Hittite rendering of Ilios, or the Hittite equivalent of Ilios, which is one of the other names, or the other name, for Troy. So regarding this settlement, Woosa or Troy, this letter between the Hittites and apparently the Greeks refers to the fact that they had a conflict over this city. According to lots of translations, a common translation that you might see online, the letter says, "Now that we have come to an agreement on Woosa over which we went to war." So that's fascinating, because that seems to confirm that there was a war between the Hittites and the Greeks in the Bronze Age at the time of the Trojan War. This letter is dated to about 1250 BCE, which fits in well with the general era in which the Greeks placed the Trojan War. The most famous date for the Trojan War is 1183 BCE, which comes from Eratosthenes. But that wasn't the only estimate for the date of the Trojan War in ancient records. We also find estimates that place it in the 13th century, the 1200s BCE. Like Herodotus, for example, he placed it, as people often say, 800 years before his time, which would place it in the middle of the 13th century BCE. That's not actually right, but let's just go along with it for now. That's what people say. So this would mean that the date of this letter fits in well with the commonly given date for the Trojan War, the era in which the Greeks believed the Trojan War took place. So we have this general situation where the Greeks were campaigning militarily in Western Anatolia, and specifically they went to war with the Hittites over Woosa, which is Troy. So that seems like an excellent fit for the Trojan War. However, there are some key issues with this. There are some really important problems with this. So for one thing, the record in question doesn't actually refer to a war. Well, it might refer to a war, but it doesn't use the word war. Although the most commonly given translation is over which we went to war, that's not really an accurate translation. The word used, which is translated war, is actually just the generic word for conflict or hostilities, which is why in some other more modern respected translations, you'll often find renderings such as over which we were hostile, or other variations of that, a general idea of hostilities or conflict, but not specifically a war. It might mean war, but it might not. There are lots of other ways to be hostile about something. It could have actually just been hostility in terms of words. They could have just been arguing over it without any actual actions being taken. It could have involved trade. It could have involved any number of things. There's no indication in the letter that it actually involved any kind of military campaign. So that fundamentally undermines the idea that this is talking about the Trojan War. However, there's an even bigger problem, because like I said, that could potentially be talking about war, although it doesn't necessarily mean war, but it could be talking about war. But there's another problem which is even bigger. So in that very same passage, in the same line, in fact, there's an explicit reference to the fact that this hostility was ended peacefully. It explicitly says, "The king of Hatti has persuaded me about the matter of the land of Woosa, concerning which he and I were hostile to each other, and we have made peace." So the issue involving Woosa, whether it was warfare or a trade war or just an exchange of hostile words, it came to an end peacefully. It did not end with the destruction of the city, which is a fundamental part of the story of the Trojan War. The story of the Trojan War talks about how the Greeks won. They defeated Troy, and Troy was completely destroyed in fire. Whereas in this Hittite record, it very explicitly explains that this conflict concerning Woosa was settled peacefully. So this emphatically cannot be the Trojan War. But this isn't the only issue. Even if we ignore these problems and say, okay, maybe it was a temporary peace and then the war continued and then Troy was destroyed or something like that. The problem is that there's no archaeological evidence for a destruction at Troy at this time. There's a destruction of Troy dated to 1300 BCE, and then there's another destruction dated to 1180 BCE, whereas this letter rather, is dated to 1250 BCE, where there's no evidence of a destruction of Troy. So this confirms that Troy wasn't destroyed when this letter was written, which confirms the understanding that this argument over Woosa was settled peacefully, just as the letter actually says. So everything indicates that this cannot be talking about the Trojan War. But this isn't the only issue with this theory either. There's also the crucial fact that in no record, no story, no poem about the Trojan War do the Hittites make an appearance. There is no reference to the Hittite Empire in any record about the Trojan War. They don't appear in the Iliad, they don't appear in Herodotus' description of the Trojan War, they don't appear in any poem, they don't appear in any reference, in any of the ancient descriptions of the Trojan War. There's no reference whatsoever to the Hittite Empire. And yet, in the Iliad and various other records, there are frequent descriptions of the allies of Troy who were supporting the city in their war against the Greeks. So there was every opportunity to mention this mighty Hittite Empire, and yet they never appear. Now, there are some people who say, well, the Hittites never appear in stories of the Trojan War because they had already fallen, mostly, by the time the war took place. That explanation relies on dating the Trojan War to 1180, which ties in with the destruction layer which occurred at that time. But if you use that scenario, then you obviously have to ignore this evidence from this letter that refers to a conflict involving Woosa. You can't use that and have the explanation that the Trojan War occurred in 1180. So, if you conclude the Trojan War occurred in 1180, then the answer is definitely no. The Trojan War isn't mentioned in Hittite records because that earlier conflict over Woosa doesn't have anything to do with the Trojan War. On the other hand, if you do identify that as being the Trojan War, that letter being a reference to the Trojan War, then you obviously can't place the Trojan War in 1180 and you can't place it after the fall of the Hittite Empire. So you're left with this big issue of, well, how or why does the Hittite Empire not appear in stories of the Trojan War? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, it's true, there is the fact, obviously, that the general scenario does match what was described in the Iliad. The fact that the Greeks were involved in campaigns in Western Anatolia at that time. But the problem with this is that the Hittites start mentioning the Ahhiyawa about 200 or maybe 300 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. And we know from archaeology that they continued settling and obviously conquering parts of Western Anatolia throughout a lot of the Dark Ages and the Archaic era. So in other words, the key point is that the Greeks were active in that area throughout many centuries, many different centuries. So there's nothing specifically special about the fact that the Mycenaean Greeks were engaged in warfare in that area in the time in which the Greeks traditionally placed the Trojan War. There's nothing special about that because you could find the same match in various different centuries throughout history. So we do really need to rely on these Hittite references to this apparent conflict involving Troy. But like I explained, there's actually nothing in that description which matches the Trojan War. Everything that we do know about what was happening at that time and the presence of the Hittite Empire and everything like that, it all contradicts the story of the Trojan War. It doesn't match it at all. So in my opinion, the answer to the question, do Hittite records describe the Trojan War, is a very definite no, they do not. Now, if you'd like to know, can Merlin from the Arthurian legends be identified as the historical Bishop Dubricius? Then come back next time to watch my next video.